Been invited to talk today. I've tried to time my comments to take about 40 minutes, which should leave lots of time for questions. I want to thank you all for inviting me here. Unfortunately, one realizes this in academia, that it's when things go wrong in my part of the world that people start inviting me to talk. So unfortunately, yes, I have a very sad occasion to speak to you today, but I do thank you for inviting me. And I was asked before the talk to say a little bit about myself. That was my biography and publications and whatnot. I'm very much a scholar of Russia, as well as Ukraine. I spent maybe two and a half years of earlier in my career living in Russia. I spent a couple of summers in Kiev, in the capital of Ukraine, which is a beautiful city. And so this has been a very personal, very troubling time. I actually have family in Russia as well. So it's been a very troubling month for me to deal with this war, but I feel that you know, as a scholar of this region, I want to share whatever wisdom I have on the events taking place. So I'll try to answer three main questions today for you, right? And then give you time to ask the other questions that I didn't get a chance to answer. First of all, why did this war start, right? Why did Putin invade Ukraine? Second of all, how has the war played out so far? It's very much still happening, as I'm sure you know. And then finally, how might the war develop, and how hopefully will it end sometime soon? So I want to start with the first question, which gets us kind of at the context of the current conflict. So as you might know, Ukraine is a country with a fairly close history with Russia. It's a neighboring country. Ukrainians have a language that's quite similar to Russian, although not necessarily mutually intelligible all the time. They have similarities in terms of religion, in terms of culture, and in terms of history. The general broad phenomenon which explains this war is that Ukraine, along with other countries, have been moving away from Russian influence. Countries that were in the former Soviet bloc, and especially the former Soviet Union, have been pulling away from the influence of Russia and moving further in terms of culture, society, economy, towards Western Europe and the European Union. And that's really the kind of crux of the kind of context that explains the war. But that's a very broad one. So I want to break this down into two kind of parts. One part of this equation is essentially Russian Empire, understanding Russia as an empire, right? And then the second one is Russia and the West. And so starting off, it's important for us to realize that Russia, for most of its history, has been a multinational empire. A country that's been ruled by decree from above and has essentially forced different peoples under its rule. And the important part of this is that Ukraine was a very important part of the Russian Empire, as I'll talk about in a little more depth in a second. The critical framing here is that Russia, you could think about the final, perhaps, collapse of Russian Empire as happening in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell. Right? There had been the Tsarist Empire, then there was a communist empire, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. But that, of course, fell, and the single Soviet Union, which was really dominated by Russia, fell into 15 separate republics, which are independent. And the important part here is that you know, Russians have had a very hard time since 1991, considering their place in the world outside of an empire, outside of this large multinational state. And the empire is deeply ingrained in Russian history, in Russian geography, is this massive landmass with 11 different time zones. And so, and of course, Russia, the Russian Federation, as it's called today, is officially the successor state of the Soviet Union, right? It holds the seat in the UN Security Council. It's the fragment that claims to have come directly from the Soviet Union. And so, while Russia has, lives inside its borders, it's always looked at the other parts of the former Soviet Union as its own sphere of influence, right? So along with empire comes this kind of idea of great power status and being the dominant force in in what you could call Eurasia. Right? So this is the critical fact here is this loss of empire that came with the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the 1990s, I lived there for some of the time. Russia went from this, half of the Cold War Europe, this huge superpower, to being an extremely troubled society, an impoverished society, a society based on loans from the West to meet its financial needs, and so on. And so this was most Russians have viewed this as kind of a humiliation, right? A loss when the Soviet Union fell. And so what's the importance of all of this? Well, the person who's directly responsible for the war is this person you see on the lower left and on the right, Vladimir Putin, who was, of course, a spy. He was an intelligence operative in the KGB. Here we have his identification card for the East German secret police. And so Vladimir Putin grew up along with his friends, kind of when the Soviet Union was at its height, when it was a powerful empire, right? The height of its power. And Putin was very much a young, patriotic Soviet person, grew up in Leningrad. The KGB was what one did if one was really a hyper-patriot, I suppose. And he was in East Germany at the end of the 1980s, when the whole Soviet empire, one could say, collapsed, right? Starting with East European states, Poland and other states, and then eventually leading right to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so we know that Vladimir Putin found this, this loss of empire, this collapse of empire, as kind of a humiliating kind of event. Apparently, this is a bit of a tangent, but apparently at one point there's a story that Putin single-handedly waved a pistol at a crowd of Germans who were trying to storm the secret police office. I think this was in Dresden at the time, if I'm not mistaken. So Putin saw himself as a person of the empire and reacted extremely negatively. He then came back to his native Leningrad, which of course then became called St. Petersburg, as it is today, and he drove a taxi for a time. Which I always think that would be a very interesting taxi driver to have taken a ride with. But in any case, clearly his life history, he associated himself, and his elites associate themselves with the Soviet Union. And so when Putin came into power, late 1999, I remember this well because I was in St. Petersburg at the time. That Boris Yeltsin was the president at the time and extremely ill, and brought in Putin as kind of a young, strong leader who could pull the country together, in part, I should mention, also by waging war, in this case a war within Russia against Chechnya, which is a republic within Russia. And Putin immediately set about turning back to the Soviet political ideology, well, not necessarily the ideology of communism, but back to the symbolism of the Soviet Union as a great power. So one of the first things he did was to reinstate the old Soviet national anthem. But they took the words out of it because they didn't, they can't talk about communism anymore. So the result of that was that they had an old national anthem, but no one knew the words. Anyway, so that gives a sense of kind of the identity crisis that Russia had in the 1990s, coming out of this, out of empire, and then Putin's desire to recreate this great power status for post-Soviet Russia. So that's the first part of this. And the other part is this, right? Something that I think people in the West might not know. Right? If we look at Russia and the former Soviet states, there were, I don't even know the number off the top of my head, but over perhaps 20 million ethnic Russians who had, in many cases, migrated from Russia to other republics. Belarus here, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and many other places, right? And then when the Soviet Union fell, they found themselves outside of Russia. Right? So part of this nationalism kind of, or this kind of patriotism that Putin has, that Putin is really, or that lifted him to power and which he's kind of cultivated, is about reuniting Russia with its displaced peoples outside in other former republics of the Soviet Union. And that goes, of course, very much with the empire theme, right? That's what empires do, is they spread people across vast masses of land, and then when they collapse, they create all sorts of terrible, difficult problems. But beyond empire in the abstract, I want to spend a few minutes introducing you to Ukraine. And one could say that, in fact, the war that we've seen for what, 4 or 5 weeks now, really started a long time ago, perhaps 18 years ago, right? So Ukraine is a hugely important country. Next to Russia, it was the biggest republic of the Soviet Union. Ukraine has an interesting place in the Russian, I guess you could call it, imagination. Right? Let me actually back up a little bit here to this slide, which shows you Ukraine. And the important thing here is that when Russians look at Ukraine, they see a country that's very similar to them. And in fact, many Russians think of Ukraine as being essentially part of their, the Russians and Ukrainians are part of the same people, essentially, right? This idea goes way back in Russian history. In fact, prior to 1917, it was illegal to publish literature in the Ukrainian language because the idea was that Russians and Ukrainians were all one people. That you shouldn't have a separate Ukrainian identity that would divide Russia and divide the Russian people. So in one sense, nationhood has always been questioned, and many Russians to this day don't think of Ukraine as being a separate country, as being rightfully a separate country. We know that Vladimir Putin told George W. Bush this. He said, George, Ukraine isn't a real country. And he believed it very much. So you have this kind of, and the eastern part of the country is an area where there's a huge Russian-speaking population, and some ethnic Russians as well, perhaps 20% of the population. The western part of the of Ukraine, this part out here, has a very different historical trajectory, right? So if areas, the capital and east, many of these areas have spent 300 plus years living in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. These territories to the west, Lviv you might have heard of, which is the major city in western Ukraine where there's lots of international reporters these days. These areas entered Russia, in fact, very late, World War II. And prior to that, they had been part of Poland. They had been part of the Austrian Empire. Well, actually, the Austrian Empire, and then it collapsed, and they became part of interwar Poland. So they have a very different historical trajectory. So when Russians look at Ukraine, they think of kind of the Eastern Ukrainians as being kind of our people. Right, in a very imperial and patronizing kind of way. And then they look at the West Ukrainians as being kind of hostile. The other Ukrainians, the Ukrainians that don't trust us, that don't want to live in our state, in our community, right? And this explains very much Putin's thinking about the war. So leading up to sorry, I should back up and talk about how this political change has kind of emerged within Ukraine. So as I mentioned, Ukraine has these different historical trajectories. An eastern and central part of the country that's closer to Russia, and a western part of the country that's quite independent. And Ukrainian politics, really until, for the first more than a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine went back and forth, kind of between far more political forces that were far more friendly to Russia, and then which were rooted in the east of the country, and political forces that were much more nationalistic and rooted in the west of the country. And this balance kind of held for a long time, right? Ukraine was kind of half in, half out of the Russian sphere. 2004 already, in 2004 one saw the so-called Orange Revolution, in which for the first time the kind of pro-Western, pro-European forces scored a political victory in Ukraine, right? And the critical date I want to point to you here is 2008, in which the North Atlantic Treaty Organization essentially made an agreement to promise Ukraine membership in NATO eventually, right? We know that the United States was much more eager to offer this security pact to Ukraine, and Germany and France were much more reluctant. So their compromise was, eventually we'll let you in, but not anytime soon. And then going from there, the other country, which is the other post-Soviet Republic of Georgia, was also granted this this kind of status, and saw a war the next year in which Russia defeated Georgia. So that brings us to 2014. 2014 was, as I'm sure you remember, or you perhaps remember, I think it was quite widely covered in the United States, this so-called Maidan Revolution. The Maidan is the name of the main square in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, where you saw, it's actually started a conflict that started when Europe was in the process of creating a kind of cooperation economic deal with Ukraine. And Putin stepped in, didn't approve of this, and tried to pull the Ukrainian government at that time further away from this, from the European Union. And what this led to was a popular revolution, very much a popular revolution, kind of with barricades in the streets and everything. And eventually the pro-Russian leader was essentially removed through force by the Ukrainian population. And that's when you can really see the beginning of this war, which is still going on today, which is 2014. Right? So in response to this new turn of Ukrainian politics away from Russia and towards the West, Putin did essentially two things. He annexed the Crimean Peninsula, which is now part of Russia, although not recognized as such internationally. And he also started essentially supporting separatists in the eastern part of Ukraine. In the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. Those areas, so the current war started when Putin acknowledged the independence of these statelets, these small states in East Ukraine, and then offered Russian military support for them, and that's how the war took off. So to kind of summarize kind of what I've given you to kind of explain the current war, right? Is that from the Russian point of view, Ukraine is rightfully part of the Russian sphere. And I want to emphasize, this isn't, of course, all Russians who think this. There's many people you've seen who are getting arrested for protesting this, so I'm not trying to explore this in too broad strokes. But from the perspective of the Kremlin, Ukraine is not rightfully a separate country. It belongs in the Russian sphere, and Putin realized that he was losing Ukraine. He was losing influence in Ukraine, and that's really what started the spark for the new conflict that has occurred. But just briefly, I mentioned a minute ago when I kind of went through the politics of Ukraine that, of course, the critical issue here was also not just Ukraine and Russia and the empire, the first theme, it was also about Russia and the West. And this is the other crucial factor in explaining how this horrific war has begun. So I want to, I can show you an image of NATO expansion since 1997, right? and which shows that the entire empire of the Soviet Union has slowly moved away from Russian influence and joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so from the Russian point of view, this is, or from Putin's point of view, I should emphasize, this is essentially an encroachment into Russia's proper sphere of influence. And that's kind of the way that they usually depict things. And what's important here is that, Putin, I think, when he came to power, he had some idea that maybe he could cooperate with the United States, right? If he got respect as a great power, if his Russia were treated the same way the Soviet Union was treated, kind of as the big boy in the international community, then maybe he could be satisfied and have some sort of a productive relationship with the United States and other countries. But a few things got in the way of this. I think from early on, Putin decided that, in fact, the United States didn't take Russia's security concerns into consideration. We see this in the Iraq War and in other conflicts. But the really difficult thing was these revolutions. I already talked about the Maidan Revolution of 2014, right? When this revolution against pro-Russian authority in Kiev, in the capital of Ukraine, happened in 2014. And Putin looked at these revolts, right? This is the Maidan Revolution, and this is the Orange Revolution. And they're called color revolutions, right? Because the revolutionaries would take a color, essentially. This happened elsewhere as well in the post-Soviet space. And these really were revolutions, uprisings against kleptocratic, corrupt, inefficient governments, right? They were popular anger against these governments, but Putin looked at this differently. Putin looked at this and said, this is a plot from the West to encroach on Russian borders, essentially, to spread their influence into our part of the world, our neck of the woods, so to speak. And Putin was very explicit about this. Putin often says what he thinks about things. He said, as far as color revolutions are concerned, I think everything is clear. It is a well-tested scheme for destabilizing society. At one point he said, well, Hillary Clinton must have given an order from the State Department to bring out all of these people into the square. Of course, that's nonsense. It's a conspiracy theory. But I mean, not that there wasn't some support in, from the United States in terms of pro-democratic civil society programs. But you don't. You can't. This isn't a faked event. These are real popular revolutions. But from Putin's point of view, he read this in this particularly conspiratorial way, as essentially part of this idea of a kind of fortress Russia, surrounded by enemies, bent on kind of encroaching on Russian territory. And in addition, Putin saw this very much in personal terms, because there were some protests in Russia itself. And Putin said, aha, now they're trying to take power from me. So it became a very kind of personal kind of politics of revenge, I guess, to say, look, I'm going to show you and take Crimea and fight back against the United States, right? So that's the kind of hopefully you've been able to follow this. That's the kind of story, I think, right? You have a story of the empire, of a resistance to Ukraine having its own national identity, charting its own course in the world, and then you superimpose that into Putin, with Putin's hostility towards the United States and this kind of geopolitical game. And when you put those two things together, you kind of explain why Putin launched this war. And what's really important is to understand is that Putin declared, I don't know if you've heard this, Putin declared his war aims as as essentially the denazification of Ukraine. And everyone said, what? Isn't the president of Ukraine of Jewish origin? Yes, he is. He's also a native Russian speaker. So you could, but this is part of this imperial relationship, and the language of this imperial kind of relationship comes from World War II. right? And the Russian view that they won World War II, and this idea that essentially, well, it also disparaging the contribution of the Allies, but also this idea that essentially establishing victory in World War II as kind of the, oh, sorry, should I be moving over this way? As the kind of crux of this popular patriotism in Russia. Many Ukrainians had started to think about World War II differently and say, well, wait a second, how did World War II end? Well, they defeated Hitler, and then Stalin came back and took us over. So maybe this is a war against both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and of course, from Putin's point of view, this was anathema. And Putin, I should mention, actually wrote an article about 6 months before the war starts, in which he says very blatantly, Russians and Ukrainians were one people. Essentially, if Russia and Ukraine are divided, it's the result of deliberate efforts by those forces that have always sought to undermine our unity. Ukrainian nationalists of the United States is essentially what he means, right? So this imperial relationship and overlapped with the geopolitical relationship. So I want to move to the second question I posed, which is, how is the war going? And here I'm not a professional military specialist, but the importance of understanding, in order to understand how the war is gone, one has to, I think, understand the first part of my lecture, which is, why did Putin wage this war in the first place? What does Putin think about Ukraine? Why has this conflict come to be? Because so far, the war has gone overwhelmingly in Ukraine's favor. Right? There was, Putin essentially launched this invasion from several different points, including the north, trying to essentially take Kiev. Putin seems to have thought that this would be a cakewalk, that the Ukrainians are just like us. That the Ukrainians are sympathetic to Russia, they're being oppressed by a quote-unquote Nazi regime in Kiev, and if we come in, they'll be throwing us flowers and inviting us into their country, and everything will go well. So it's quite clear that the military operation was completely botched by Putin, in part because he didn't think it was going to be a real war. He seems to have thought it would be a very limited operation to seize the capital, which he would somehow do with relative ease. People who know Ukraine, and I count myself as one of them, knew that this was a total misconception of what Ukraine was, right? Over Ukrainian history, particularly since independence in 1991, Ukraine has really become a fairly unified country. Right? And I mentioned earlier that people in East Ukraine tend to speak Russian, in many cases, in the cities at least. And then, Western Ukraine tends to be more Ukrainian speaking. But this linguistic divide was really misleading. Because I think Ukrainians were much more united than these linguistic issues would suggest. Many of the people who protested on the Maidan against the pro-Russian government were Russian speakers, right? But they came to love their homeland, they loved Ukraine, they considered themselves Ukrainians. So I think that one has to pry apart this language issue from patriotism. And I think Putin, in fact, saw Ukraine entirely incorrectly. Right? And many people in the West did too. We have to remember that the Biden administration said, oh yeah, we think Kiev will fall in a few weeks, or a few days maybe, I think he said at the beginning, right? It was absolutely wrong, right? So I think this Ukraine's resilience as a nation has surprised a lot of people, but I think it was there to see perhaps all along for some people. So that's the first part, right? That Ukraine didn't collapse. The people didn't greet the Russian soldiers as liberators, as they define themselves to be. And then there's more to the story, I think, as well. Ukraine, I think, fought well, had, with the assistance of the US military, other militaries in NATO, had actually prepared very well for this exact situation and knew that some sort of war with Russia could be coming. And so I think that they've fought extremely valiantly, which, you know, and it's not surprising in a sense because it is a war for their national survival. Right? The way Putin started this war, he made no, he did not hide the fact that he thought that Ukraine should be wiped off the map and that, you know, it should be part of Russia in some form or another. And this has aroused a real wave of patriotism among the Ukrainian people. But then even beyond that, right? So Putin's misconceptions, the flawed military planning, all of that that's gone into this, there's more to the story than that as well, because part of the issue is that you know, Russian troops weren't ready for this operation. In some cases, they were conscripts. They were told they were going on a training exercise, and then the next day they were being shot at in some Ukrainian village. Right? So the Russian soldiers weren't prepared for this, and they viewed the Ukrainians as, of course, their people. The same as them, right? There's many Russian speakers, there's many ethnic Russians in this area, right? So in many cases they were confronting people who they were very close to. And I think that's very important to understand the horrific morale that the Russian army has faced. As you've maybe seen in the news, there's been, you know, hundreds of abandoned tanks and people just kind of leaving their equipment by the side of the road and this kind of thing. And some desertion, some discipline problems, and these kinds of things. So I think that's another way in which Putin kind of made a giant mistake here by essentially assuming that you could have Russians fight Ukrainians and they'd be okay with doing it. I think that's proven to be a very difficult ask of them. I should also mention, of course, in this that of course the West has stepped in. This invasion of Ukraine, which was so incredibly flagrant, caused all sorts of interesting geopolitical transformations in Europe. Germany essentially started boosting its military spending, which is not something it's wanted to do since 1945, and started arming Ukraine. The EU, the US, all of these sanctions that have been placed on the Putin regime. There's debate about how effective those sanctions can be, but it is really an effort at kind of economic warfare to destroy the Russian economy. So I think Putin got all of these things wrong when he brought this invasion. But I do want to emphasize that I also think one of the so in some senses there's a success story, if you agree with the existence of the Ukrainian state as I do, that the Ukrainians were able to fight back quite valiantly, and the soldiers in red here have all left. So it's only in the eastern part of the country, and of course Crimea, where the Russian soldiers are now located, and it seems like this is going to be, these republics here are going to be the staging ground for some very brutal fighting in the coming weeks and perhaps months. So the war goes on. You might think that this is a success story, this is happy, but of course, war is never happy, but also what we discovered the last week, right? Last Sunday, this is, from the beginning, Russia has engaged in essentially war crimes by, shelling civilians areas where there are no military objects, in the environs, shelling hospitals, attacking civilian homes, fighting in a really brutal way. And one sees this perhaps most of all in Mariupol, which is the city which is now essentially surrounded by the Russian troops on the Black Sea coast, which it seems to be absolutely horrific what is happening there. The loss of life we could be talking about tens of thousands of people, civilians who have been killed in these battles that Russia has unleashed. But beyond that, of course, one has, and forgive me for this brutal image, but one has in this town of Puget in West Ukraine. So territory, essentially, it's up here, I think northwest of Kiev. When the Russian troops left, One, it was discovered that there were, in this town, that there were about 400 corpses of civilians, that you know, there were extremely brutal crimes against humanity, civilians being shot for no reason with their hands tied behind their back, you know, absolutely horrific kinds of scenes. And I think we're still trying to, you know, I think it's hard to understand how this happened, how high up the orders were given. Was this Putin saying, fight the war in this brutal way? It's hard to know. Was it more Russian troops surrounded in these Ukrainian communities being shot at, who then, you know, kind of succumb to kind of battle rage and take out anger against civilians who were, you know, an easy target? That's happened in many historical episodes, right? This kind of wartime brutalization, it's sometimes called, has happened in many other scenarios. And it's hard to know, and of course on a moral level it shouldn't matter, because these are war crimes, these are, you know, this has brought this already horrific conflict. I haven't even mentioned that there are 4 million refugees beyond Ukrainian borders, or even more perhaps. But it's taken this whole conflict to another level. And I want to kind of spend just a few minutes finishing up and leaving time for your questions by considering my third question, which is, where are things going to go from now, from here? And of course, who knows, and thankfully I'm a historian, I can analyze the past. It's already happened, right? I get it right every time. I know how it turned out, right? But you know, predictions are a messy business. But I do think that that we can say some things. Right? You know, I think it's extremely troubling, but we have to face the fact that peace is not coming immediately. I don't see how that could happen. Putin has managed to thus far essentially lose part of a war, at least, or the first stage of a war against Ukraine. As I mentioned, they see the Ukrainians as being a kind of subordinate people, in colonial lens, essentially. So I can't imagine Putin pulling back. He must feel he has to show some sort of victory. That's the concern, right? Something to show. He's a strong man. He has to show he got something out of this, right? And sell it to his own public. That's my fear. Of course. The Ukrainians are doing well now in this war, so they have no incentive to stop the fighting anytime soon. They might start thinking that they can win the war. Perhaps that's possible. It's hard to know. And of course, the fact that these horrible war crimes have been exposed makes ending the war so much harder, because from the Ukrainian perspective, right, how can you trust anything that Putin signs, right? And that's a very valid concern. You know, if you reach a deal, is Putin going to just, you know, break it, violate it? Some Ukrainians I've talked to have said kind of, well, look, if we end this war now, Russia's just going to invade down the road, right? And we don't want to hand off to our children this long-going military conflict. So we have to, you know, suffer now and try to win. That's the kind of Ukrainian mindset. And then, of course, the other issue is that if Putin does make you know, claims on territory, or in a sense even stays in the areas he's had for several years, given what we know about these horrible war crimes that have been committed, Ukrainians feel that they're abandoning their fellow Ukrainians to horrific crimes, right? So there's a real incentive not to give up any territory to Russia, given what we know. So this is extremely a very difficult situation. My fear is that this could go on for weeks or months. It might turn into a situation where the fighting continues until one of the two sides collapses, or something like that. This is horrible. You know, it's horrible to imagine the human cost of this war, which is so high now. Perhaps a quarter of the Ukrainian population has been displaced either as refugees beyond the borders or within Ukraine, right, as internally displaced people. So it's very hard to imagine a swift end to this war that will save much human suffering. And I can speculate, if you're interested, about, you know, what could happen on either side. It's potentially possible that Russia could enter some sort of era of instability. Putin could be overthrown. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but it's possible. Russian history is full of very sharp turns at moments when people didn't necessarily expect them. So unfortunately this is where we stand. So I think I'd like to stop now, and that leaves us about 15 minutes. I was almost on time. Leaves us maybe 15 minutes for questions and any clarifications on anything you'd like to ask about. Yes?
Yes, I'd like to address a point that you haven't made but is on all our minds, and that is how likely is it, and under what circumstances would it happen, that this war becomes more of a world war, or at least a war that includes some or all of Europe?
Yes. In my notes, didn't get to it, my apologies. And yes, that is the horrific danger, isn't it? I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. The danger that one potential red line is the use of weapons of mass destruction, and it's possible that that's already happened. There's been a report out of Mariupol 2 days ago from Ukrainian soldiers who claim to have been, that a drone carried some sort of gas and dropped gas on them, right? So I'm not saying that necessarily would lead to an escalation. But I mean, I think the really big question is, what about the convoys? We know that we're arming the Ukrainians, they're coming in through West Ukraine. What if Putin attacked some of these shipments close to the border and hit some Polish soldiers or something, who of course are NATO members, and then you get into the situation of Article 5 of the treaty, and you could get into extremely dangerous territory. When the war started, Putin raised, or he said at least, he raised essentially the warning level for the Russian nuclear arsenal. And very pointedly, the Biden administration did not make any changes, and I think canceled some ICBM, some nuclear tests, if I'm not mistaken, in the last weeks. So I think it's definitely on the minds of American leaders, other leaders in Europe, that this is of paramount importance, of course, to avoid an escalation. The problem with that, of course, is, how do we know what constitutes this escalation for Putin, right? So, for instance, until just about a few days ago, the United States and other countries were providing Ukrainians with quote-unquote defensive weapons, right? So weapons, anti-tank weapons, against airplane, aerial weapons, these kinds of things, right? On the assumption that if we start giving the Ukrainians tanks and airplanes, then this is an offensive operation. Putin will interpret it as such, and you could get this kind of spiraling that could lead to a wider escalation. That taboo has already been broken, if it was a taboo, if that's the right word for it. Already, the Slovaks have been sending larger air defense systems. I can't remember which country sent tanks, but they're being sent as well. So already there's this movement in the kind of armaments that are being sent, and of course no one knows what Putin says. The sanctions against Russia are a declaration of war. Well, he clearly doesn't think that because he hasn't, launched a nuclear weapon at the United States, right? So it's very hard to know what constitutes escalation, what the points of no return would be, because you're dealing with Putin. Putin doesn't have an incentive to be honest about that, right? On the contrary, his incentive is to say anything you do is World War III, and they say that constantly. Right? So the challenge facing, I guess, policymakers is to try to understand this is exactly like the Cold War, right? Understand what the opponent is thinking. And as we know, unfortunately, during the Cold War, we weren't necessarily always right about some of these assumptions of the opponent. So I'm not trying to, I think, as things stand, I sure hope that escalation won't happen, but I certainly am not in a position to say it's impossible. I think something like this could happen, unfortunately. You know, and of course when bombs start flying, accidents happen, and things can escalate beyond where anyone thought events would go. So I'm not sure that's a very satisfying answer, but I'm not sure anyone could give you a satisfactory answer, unfortunately. Yeah. Yes?
Putin has recently, today, said that the peace talks are going to be stopped. And I'm wondering, what is a realistic, what kind of brownie can we give Russia, Putin, so that he could leave with a feeling like he can say that he accomplished something?
That is really a good question. You know, and I think the problem is, you know, there's that question in the abstract. What would it take Putin? But then, of course, there's the question, what is it feasible to give Putin, given that, you know, what would the Ukrainians agree to? Are we comfortable in telling Ukraine to give up their territory? So far, we haven't been, and I think it would be very hard to strong-arm the Ukrainians into handing over territory to Russia. What would be sufficiently, I like the brownie metaphor. So I guess that there's two questions. What would be the brownie that would be enough for Putin? And then, does he deserve the brownie and should we give it to him, right? But in the first category, I mean, I guess, presumably, right when the Ukrainian or the Russians were retreating from the north, they came out with this pronouncement saying, oh, well, that was just the first phase of the war. Everything's going fine, but we're going to switch over to East Ukraine now. Clearly, it was a face-saving measure because the war was not going well for them. But presumably, if they took perhaps these two, by the way, I'm not suggesting that any deal should be granted on anything like this. But if perhaps if Putin took the entirety of these two republics, the Luhansk and Donetsk republics, could he turn to the Russian public and say, hooray, we won, everything's great? He probably could. But the problem is, it's so hard to know the restraints that these actors are working under. Like in Russia, a dictator who has absolute power, the moment he looks weak, Putin could be very worried that he could be thrown out somehow, right? So in other words, we don't necessarily know what is sufficient for Putin to declare victory and go home. I think that's the troubling point. The troubling point. So I'm sorry I couldn't come up with a better answer, but I think this is, for the moment at least, with the Ukrainians doing well in the war, I don't think that's on anyone's minds at the moment. But of course, if things start going very badly for Ukraine, which they could, then I think that the pressure will be on to give something to Putin and to try to extricate the Ukrainians from the situation.
Is there any connection with the war and oil or pipelines or access to the Black Sea? I mean, is there something going on underneath that?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, there's so many things going on that I didn't mention, I realize, but one of the big issues here is that Russia's gas pipelines go through Ukraine to reach Western Europe. And surprisingly, they haven't been hit. While Russia has been destroying Ukrainian infrastructure, they've missed those pipelines, right? So yes, the first casualty of the war, or really before the war, was there was Germany. Russia was creating this pipeline over the Baltic Sea to send gas to Europe away from Ukraine, so Ukraine to bypass Ukraine, right? And the Germans, I think to their credit, canceled this agreement, or at least suspended it during the lead up to war. So that's certainly an important factor. And now the bigger factor, and again, getting to the idea that this is incredible stupidity from Putin's point of view. He's absolutely made every mistake possible, but now the European Union is talking about weaning themselves off of Russian gas and oil. And if they do that, what's the basis of the Russian economy, right? Not a whole lot. And of course, oil you can put in barrels and ship everywhere you want, but the gas pipelines go west to redirect all those pipelines to China. That's a hugely expensive and difficult, proposition. right? So I think it is very much of crucial importance here. And the big question is already Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. I believe all three countries have already. Do I have a good map of Europe here? The former Soviet Baltic states have already stopped buying all fossil fuels from Russia. But to do that in Germany, to do that, in some of these other countries that are very dependent, that would be extremely difficult politically, I think, for political leaders. So we'll see where things will go with that. As things stand, it's only kind of a longer-term plan to get off of Russian fossil fuels. But we'll see if that speeds up with the outcome of the war.
This may be too personal of a question, but you started by saying you have family and friends in Russia. And I'm wondering if you have had any contact with them, because we are reading and learning that they are denying all of this and they're buying into what Putin is telling them. And you may not be able to want to answer that, but I was just curious, personally, if you have information.
Yeah, personally, I haven't. These are my in-laws. I haven't been raising the issue particularly every now and then, but I think the process in Russia is very interesting, right? Because of course you're almost in a kind of martial law now in Russia, right? They didn't pass a martial law. It's not official. But they're arresting people for long sentences, incarcerating people for making statements about the war. So, for instance, one protester stood by a monument with Kiev written by it, of course, part of the Soviet Union, and opened the book *War and Peace* by Tolstoy, and was arrested. So that gives you a sense of the political climate in Russia these days. And so I think that there certainly is a rally around the flag effect happening in Russia, but I think it's a very difficult dynamic. People don't want to necessarily believe that this is happening, but does that mean they don't know, right? And I think things like this, we're in the early days yet, right? You look at World War I, I'm a historian, 4 years into World War I, the entire Russian Empire collapses, right? So I think that there could be real kinds of instability in Russia. And I also think that there are probably a lot of people who do oppose the war but are reluctant to say that. And that's not at all to take the responsibility from people who are silent or who are justifying these horrific crimes, right? Many people many people are silent, but on the other hand, if you're going to go out and get protest and be put in jail for 15 years, I might also have some second thoughts about acting that way too, right? It takes incredible courage to act in these kinds of situations. So I'm sorry if that's, I think like so many things, there are a lot of unknowns here, and one of them I think is Russian public opinion.
Yeah, we know that the International Criminal Court is, the U.S. is not a signatory to that, but together with the United Nations, could there be a gathering emphasis that the threat of Putin coming before the International Criminal Court could be maybe enough to jeopardize Putin's own standing within Russia?
That's a good question. I don't think in any kind of immediate sense, but to me the International Criminal Court, which there will be some sort of legal process, as I understand, right? They're gathering evidence, and there will be, is that the entire Russian elite might not be able to travel abroad. And that's, of course, something I didn't mention, but the Russian elite has very connected to they stash their money in the West, some ill-gotten gains in many cases. And I think that for the notion, already Putin has been sanctioned, right? The notion that any member of Putin's elite goes abroad and could face arrest, this creates a lot of pressure on the Putin regime. So I'm not sure it would necessarily be in discrediting Putin per se, but I think it is something that in the longer term could put a lot of pressure on the Russian elite.
would like to go back just a minute to the mention about Putin denazifying Ukraine. Is there anything at all that he is actually focused on? Or has he made the whole thing up? I mean, I realize what you said about the glory of Russia winning World War II, but has there been anything there that he's focused on?
Well, yeah, I mean, right. I mean, it's a case of, you know, taking together some strands and putting it together into something else entirely, right? There were, in 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there were some essentially volunteer divisions who were radical nationalists, in many cases anti-Semites, and you could call them Nazis, right? Who fought in 2014 when the, you know, and then in following years had then been absorbed into the Ukrainian army. So some of the units located in Mariupol are from the so-called Azov division, right? Who are, I think it's safe to say, radical nationalists, right? There is a record of collaboration with Nazis during World War II of some Ukrainian nationalists. Of course, the problem here is that leaders like Putin tend to pick and choose their history. There were Russians who collaborated with the Nazis, ethnic Russians. There, you know, so yes, there's enough of a there for him to form this false image, right? And his propagandists, who are very sophisticated propagandists, right? But I think I think there's you know, and I do think it was a clever narrative, because I think often in the Western press we would say, yeah, the Russians were the good guys in World War, you know, along with us. And what about those Ukrainians? Were they, you know, what were they really doing, right? So I think I think it's important for us not to buy this narrative, even when we can take it apart and see some of the varying components that were put into it, if that makes sense.
There was a lot of fighting in eastern Ukraine for years, 14 years, 18 years and whatnot. Who was fighting whom? And to what extent was Russia involved in that at the time?
Yes, this is a very important question. There clearly were, when Kiev fell during the Maidan Revolution in 2014, there clearly were people in these republics who felt that Russian culture was under threat, who were afraid of the, you know, Nazis from the west of the country taking over their communities. So there was a separatist move in some of these areas in 2014. Of course, the problem here is that we know now that the Russian army was also sending in forces, right? So clearly Russia was involved. They denied they were, but when fighting started in 2014, all of a sudden thousands of troops would appear out of nowhere, heavily armed. And it was clear that they were Russian troops, right? Even if they weren't acknowledging that they were Russian troops. And then since then, these statelets that have been under essentially Russian rule since 2014, you know, I've talked to locals from, you know, refugees from these areas, or people who've left these areas, and Russia's increasingly in control there, right? And it's a very, these are not independent, you know, freedom-minded republics. These are places that are under very brutal, essentially Russian occupation. So if there was that separatist push, I think it's really faded away since 2014.
You pointed out that a war makes people cruel. But Russia has a long history of being unusually cruel, of the West being afraid of the Russians. How did that come about?
That's my next hour-long lecture. No, that's a big question. But of course, we cannot. We cannot forget. Putin came to power in 1999. The first thing he did was start this war in Chechnya, and his casus belli, essentially, or the reason he went to war, were these apartment bombings, in which apartment buildings all across Russia blew up. And to this day, many intelligent people, and this is a moment where sometimes conspiracy theories are right, you know, so every now and then they are, especially in Russia, they seem to happen and be right fairly often, or sometimes, but it could well be that Putin bombed his own citizens in order to unify them around him in 1919, or sorry, in 1999. You know, and then of course the Syrian war, we can't forget that, where these same tactics of bombing hospitals, bombing civilian areas. So it's obviously a Putin problem. Many people have not taken him seriously and not understood the threat that he's posed, I think, and the severity of of what kind of political regime Putin had, and kind of thought, well, he says crazy things, he's just some crazy Russian leader over there, but he's never going to do any of this stuff, is he? Well, guess again, he has.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Tromly.